My brother-in-law raised his glass to toast his own promotion before our father-in-law had even finished his sentence. That should have told me everything I needed to know about him. But I was still 3 years away from understanding how deep that hunger ran. The dining room at my parents' house in Charlotte smelled like roasted chicken, and the candles my mother always lit for family dinners, even ordinary Tuesday ones. My husband's hand found mine under the table, squeezing once the way he did when he could feel tension building before anyone else noticed it. I'm Megan Whitfield, and I was 34 years old. The night my father-in-law stood at the head of that table and announced that he was finally ready to talk about who would take over Whitfield Hardware. I should explain what that meant, because to anyone outside our family, it probably sounds like nothing. A chain of 6 hardware stores scattered across the Carolinas doesn't sound glamorous. It doesn't sound like the kind of thing people fight over in movies. But Whitfield Hardware was 41 years old. My father-in-law, Gerald, had built it from a single cinderblock building off Route 49 into something that employed almost 90 people and turned a profit every single year except the year of the financial crash. It was the kind of business that smelled like sawdust and motor oil and felt, when you walked into any of the stores, like stepping into something solid and permanent in a world that mostly wasn't. My husband Ryan and his older brother Trent had grown up working the registers and stocking shelves every summer of their childhood. Their mother, Carol, had passed when the boys were teenagers, and Gerald had raised them mostly alone, with the stores as a kind of third parent, always present, always demanding attention. I'd married into this family 8 years earlier, and from the very first Thanksgiving, I understood the unspoken hierarchy. Trent was the one who talked business with Gerald. Trent was the one who got invited to vendor meetings and supplier dinners. Trent was already calling himself the future CEO at family gatherings, half joking, but only half. Ryan never seemed bothered by it, or at least he never let it show. Ryan was the quiet one, the one who'd gone into mechanical engineering instead of staying in the family business, the one who built drones and worked for an aerospace contractor outside Raleigh and came home every single night to actually cook dinner with me, instead of talking about quarterly numbers. I loved that about him. I loved that he didn't need his father's approval the way Trent seemed to. But there were nights, quiet ones, when I'd catch him staring at old photographs of the original store, and I knew some small part of him still wondered what it would have been like to be the son who mattered. That night at dinner, Gerald cleared his throat the way he always did before saying something he'd rehearsed. "I'm 68 years old," he said. "My knees don't work the way they used to, and my doctor's been hounding me about my blood pressure for 2 years now. It's time I started thinking seriously about succession." Trent set down his fork with theatrical solemnity, as if he'd been waiting his whole life for this exact sentence. "Dad, you know I've been ready for this conversation for years." "I know you have," Gerald said, and something in his voice made me look up. There was an exhaustion there I hadn't heard before, the particular weariness of a man who has been performing pride in someone for a long time and is starting to feel the strain of it. "The stores will go to whichever of my sons proves he can actually run them," Gerald continued. "Not just manage the day-to-day. Build something. Protect something. I'm not interested in titles. I'm interested in legacy." Trent's smile didn't waver, but I noticed his jaw tighten slightly, the way it did whenever something didn't go exactly according to the script he'd written in his head. "Of course, Dad. That's fair." I watched Ryan across the table. He hadn't said a word the entire conversation, just turned his water glass slowly between his fingers, the same nervous habit he'd had since I met him at a friend's barbecue 9 years ago. I knew what he was thinking without him having to say it. He wasn't competing. He'd never been competing. The stores belonged to Trent in everyone's mind, including, I suspected, Ryan's own. What none of us knew that night, sitting around that table with the candles burning low and the chicken going cold, was that Gerald had already quietly begun a process that would take 3 years to unfold. and that by the time it finished, the family we thought we knew would be unrecognizable. The first 6 months after that dinner, almost nothing seemed to change on the surface. Trent threw himself into the business with a kind of performative intensity that exhausted everyone around him. He started showing up to family events with spreadsheets, actually printed spreadsheets, that he'd pull out to demonstrate quarterly growth in the Asheville location, or new vendor contracts he'd negotiated for the flagship store. He talked about scaling the brand and modernizing the customer experience, phrases that made Gerald's eyebrows twitch in a way I couldn't quite read. Ryan, meanwhile, kept working his engineering job, kept coming home to cook dinner, kept being exactly the steady, present husband he'd always been. But I noticed something shift in him during those months, something subtle that I don't think even he was fully aware of. He started asking his father more questions, not about the business directly, not in any way that looked like competing with Trent, but real questions. What was the hardest year of running the stores? What he wished he'd done differently with the Hendersonville location after the highway rerouted traffic away from it? What kept him up at night in the early years? I asked him about it one evening while we were cleaning up after dinner, the dishwasher humming in the background. "You've been talking to your dad a lot lately." Ryan shrugged, drying a pan with more focus than the task required. "He's getting older. I don't know. I guess I just realized I never really asked him about any of it. I always assumed Trent had that covered. And now? Now I think maybe I should have been paying attention this whole time, regardless of who ends up running anything." He sets the pan down and looked at me. "It's not about the stores, Megan. It's about him. I don't want to wake up one day and realize I never really knew my own father." I didn't think much of it then. I thought it was just grief catching up to him in a delayed way, the kind of thing that happens when you watch a parent age and suddenly understand they won't be there forever. I didn't realize it was the beginning of something else entirely. About 8 months into what the family had started calling, half-jokingly, the succession watch, the Mooresville location started hemorrhaging money. It was the newest store, the one Trent had personally championed and pushed Gerald to open 18 months earlier, located in a strip mall that had looked promising on paper, but turned out to be surrounded by competitors nobody had properly scouted. A massive home improvement chain had opened less than half a mile away, just 4 months after the Whitfield location launched, and foot traffic had been declining ever since. Trent's solution was to double down. He wanted to invest another $200,000 in renovations and a marketing push, convinced that better signage and an expanded inventory would turn things around. He brought the proposal to a family meeting on a Sunday afternoon, complete with a slideshow projected onto the living room wall, charts showing projected revenue increases, that struck me, even with my limited business background, as wildly optimistic. Gerald listened to the entire presentation without interrupting. When it finished, he asked one question. "What happens if it doesn't work? What's your plan B?" Trent hesitated for just a fraction of a second too long. "It'll work, Dad. That's not what I asked." The room went quiet. I could feel Ryan tense beside me on the couch. Trent's wife, Diane, who almost never spoke at these family business discussions, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I don't think we should be talking about Plan B," Trent finally said. "I think we should be talking about commitment. You always told us that hesitation kills businesses, that you have to commit fully or not at all. I also told you that you never bet everything on hope," Gerald said quietly. "There's a difference between commitment and recklessness, son. I need you to understand that difference if you're going to run this company." I watched something flicker across Trent's face in that moment, something I'd never seen before. Not just frustration, but a kind of cornered desperation, like a man realizing the script he'd written for his own life wasn't matching the one being handed to him. The Mooresville renovation went forward anyway, against what I later learned were Gerald's private reservations. Trent had apparently gone around his father to some degree, securing partial financing through a business loan he'd taken out using a portion of his own savings. as collateral, determined to prove himself without waiting for full approval. It was a bold move, and for about 4 months it actually seemed to be working. Foot traffic increased, revenue ticked upward. Trent walked around family gatherings with the swagger of a man who'd been vindicated. Then, almost overnight, things fell apart. The home improvement chain down the road launched an aggressive price-matching campaign, specifically targeting the Whitfield store, something Trent hadn't anticipated and had no real counter for. Combined with the debt from the renovation loan, the Mooresville location went from struggling to genuinely dangerous within a single quarter. By the time Trent finally brought the real numbers to his father, the store was bleeding nearly $15,000 a month, and the loan payments were eating into cash flow across the entire company. I wasn't in the room when Gerald found out the full extent of it, but Ryan told me about it that night, his voice low and strained as we lay in bed in the dark. Dad's furious, not the loud kind. The quiet kind, which is worse. He found out Trent had been moving money between store accounts to cover the loan payments without telling him. Some of it came out of the Asheville store's operating budget. Is that legal? It's not illegal, technically. The accounts are all under the company umbrella. But it's not honest, either. Dad's basically been running blind on cash flow for 2 stores because Trent didn't want him to know how bad Mooresville had gotten. I sat up against the headboard, feeling something cold settle in my chest. What's going to happen? Ryan was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. But I think this might have changed something for Dad about who he trusts. What I didn't know yet, what none of us knew, was that Gerald had already quietly consulted with the family's longtime accountant, a sharp, soft-spoken woman named Vivian Castellano, who had managed the books for Whitfield Hardware for over 15 years, and with an estate attorney about restructuring the entire ownership plan for the company. He'd been doing this in private, in small meetings scheduled when he told everyone he was at doctor's appointments or golf outings, because he wasn't ready to make any announcements until he understood the full picture. The 18 months that followed were some of the strangest in our family's history. Mostly because everything seemed to be happening underneath the surface, while the visible parts of our lives carried on almost normally. Trent worked frantically to stabilize Mooresville, eventually closing it entirely after a brutal 6-month stretch and absorbing the loss, a decision that visibly aged him. He became more controlling at the other stores, more insistent on being included in every decision, as if proving his competence through sheer volume of involvement could erase the memory of his failure. Ryan, on the other hand, started doing something I found genuinely surprising. He began spending Saturday mornings at the flagship store, not as an employee, but just helping out, unpacking shipments, talking to the longtime staff members who'd known him since he was a teenager bagging nails behind the counter. He never made a big deal of it. He never framed it as preparation for taking over anything. He told me, when I asked, that it just felt good to be there, to remember what the place meant to him before it had become a battleground. I'm not trying to compete with Trent, he told me more than once, almost defensively, as if he needed to convince himself as much as me. I have my own career. I have a life I love with you. I just want to know the place I grew up in, before it's gone or sold or turned into something I don't recognize. I believed him, because I knew him, and because Ryan had never once in our marriage shown any sign of the hunger that drove Trent. But I also started noticing how the longtime employees lit up when Ryan walked in. How Marcus, who'd managed the flagship store for over a decade, started pulling Ryan aside to ask his opinion on inventory systems, genuinely curious about his engineering background and the efficiency improvements he suggested almost casually. How customers who'd known the family for years would ask after Ryan specifically, remembering him as a kid, trusting him in a way that felt earned rather than inherited. Gerald noticed too. I could tell by the way his eyes would follow Ryan around the store, during the rare occasions he was there himself. A quiet calculation happening behind his expression that none of us could fully read. About 2 years after that first dinner announcement, Diane called me one afternoon while I was at work, her voice tight in a way that immediately put me on edge. "Can you talk? I need to tell you something. But you cannot repeat it to Ryan yet." "I'm serious, Megan." I found an empty conference room and closed the door. "What's going on?" "Trent's been talking to a buyer. A regional hardware chain out of Tennessee. They've made an informal offer for the company, and he's seriously considering it without telling Gerald." My stomach dropped. "He wants to sell the business his father built?" "He says it's about protecting the family's financial future. He says retail is dying, that hardware stores can't compete with the big chains forever, that taking a buyout now while the offer is good is smarter than riding it into the ground." But Megan, I don't think that's really what this is about. I think he's tired. I think he's been carrying the weight of trying to prove himself for so long that he just wants out. But he doesn't know how to say that without it looking like failure. I sat there in that conference room for a long time after we hung up, turning the information over in my mind, unsure what to do with it. Part of me wanted to tell Ryan immediately. But another part of me, a part I wasn't proud of, wondered if this was somehow not my information to share, if it would only deepen a rift between brothers that already felt fragile enough to shatter at the wrong touch. In the end, I didn't have to decide, because 3 weeks later, Gerald found out on his own. He discovered an email on a shared family business account, something Trent had forgotten to delete, outlining preliminary terms with the Tennessee buyer. I wasn't there for that conversation between father and son. But Ryan told me later that it had been the worst argument he'd ever witnessed between them. Two men who rarely raised their voices, both shouting in Gerald's home office while Ryan stood frozen in the hallway, unsure whether to intervene. He told Dad he was tired of being compared to a ghost. Ryan said quietly that night, sitting on the edge of our bed with his head in his hands. He said Mom died, and Dad turned the stores into her memory, and that no matter what he did, he was always going to be measured against some impossible standard of perfection that didn't even really exist, that Dad had built up in his grief. I didn't know what to say. There was a painful truth buried somewhere in Trent's accusation, even if the way he'd handled the situation, the secrecy, the lies of omission, the unauthorized account transfers, made it hard to feel much sympathy for him in that moment. "What did your dad say?" Ryan looked up at me, and I saw something in his face I'd never seen before, a kind of sad clarity. He said that legacy was never about perfection. It was about honesty, and that Trent had broken that, over and over, in ways that mattered more than any single bad investment ever could. The months following that confrontation were quiet in a way that felt heavier than the noise that had come before. Trent backed away from the sale talks once it became clear Gerald would never sign off on them, but something between father and son had cracked that didn't fully heal. Family dinners became sparse, strained affairs. Diane confided in me that Trent had started seeing a therapist, something I respected him for, even as I struggled to fully forgive the secrecy that had nearly cost the family everything Gerald had built. Gerald, for his part, became quieter too, but in a different way. He started taking more weekday trips that he described vaguely as handling some paperwork, always with Vivian Castellano's name mentioned in passing, always followed by a subject change if anyone asked too many questions. I assumed it was related to his health, or maybe retirement planning, and I didn't push. None of us did. We were all, I think, exhausted by that point, worn down by years of tension we hadn't asked for and didn't know how to resolve. It was Ryan's 38th birthday, almost exactly 3 years after that first dinner announcement, when everything finally came into focus. Gerald insisted on hosting the celebration at the flagship store after hours, something he'd never done before. He had Marcus and a few of the longtime staff set up tables among the aisles. String lights hung from the rafters. A caterer brought in trays of barbecue and cornbread. It felt strange and wonderful at once, celebrating in the middle of shelves, stocked with paint cans and power tools. The smell of sawdust mixing with the smell of good food. About 40 people came, family and longtime employees, and a few close friends, all of them gathered between the aisles with paper plates balanced on their knees, the string lights casting a warm glow over everything. Trent and Diane arrived a little late, Trent looking thinner than he had in years, a kind of careful humility in his posture that hadn't been there before the Tennessee buyer incident. Around 8 o'clock, after the cake had been cut and the candles blown out, Gerald stood up at the front of the gathered crowd, near the old original register he'd kept as a kind of shrine near the entrance since the store's earliest days. He tapped a fork against his glass, and the room slowly quieted. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," he began, his voice a little rougher than usual. "Especially for celebrating my son on his birthday in a place that means more to this family than most people probably understand." He looked at Ryan for a long moment, and something in his expression made my chest tighten with a feeling I couldn't quite name. 41 years ago, I opened this store with nothing but a loan from my own father and more stubbornness than sense. My wife, Carol, God rest her, used to say I loved this place a little too much, that I sometimes treated it like a third child. A soft ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, gentle and warm. She wasn't wrong. But I think what she really meant was that this store became a place where I poured everything I couldn't always say out loud. Every hope I had for my boys, every fear, every piece of pride I never knew how to express directly. The room had gone very still. I felt Ryan's hand find mine, his grip tightening. I announced 3 years ago that I wanted to talk about succession, about who would carry this forward. Gerald paused, looking out over the crowd, his eyes finally settling on Trent. I watched both my sons during that time. Not because I was testing them in some cruel way, but because I needed to understand who they really were when no one was forcing them to perform for me. I needed to know who they'd be when things got hard, because things always get hard eventually, in business and in life. Trent's face had gone pale, his jaw tight. Diane reached over and took his hand. "Trent, you have a fire in you that I recognize because it's the same fire I had at your age. But fire without honesty burns down the things you're trying to build. I love you, son, and I am proud of parts of who you are. But I cannot, in good conscience, hand you the keys to something I spent 41 years building when you've shown me, more than once, that you'll cut corners and hide truths when the pressure gets high enough." A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, unsure where to look. Trent stared down at his shoes, his shoulders rigid. Then Gerald turned, and his eyes found Ryan. "Ryan, you never asked for this. You built your own life, your own career, away from these aisles, and for years, I worried that meant you didn't care about what your mother and I built here. I was wrong. These past 3 years, you showed up. Not because you wanted something from it, but because you wanted to understand it. You learned the names of every person who works here. You listened more than you talked. You never once tried to position yourself above your brother, even when it would have been easy to." My eyes were burning now, and I realized I was crying without having quite decided to. Gerald reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, plain envelope, the kind you'd buy at any drugstore. Nothing dramatic about its appearance at all, which somehow made the moment feel even heavier. I worked with Vivian and with a lawyer to restructure ownership of Whitfield Hardware into a family trust about 2 years ago. I wanted to make sure that whatever decision I made wasn't just about one dinner conversation, but about who proved, over time, through actual behavior and not promises, that they understood what this company actually requires. He held the envelope out toward Ryan. "This appoints you as the controlling trustee, effective immediately. Full operational authority over all 6 locations. Trent will remain a partner and an officer of the company, with an ownership stake that reflects his years of work here. And I am asking you, Ryan, to find a real role for your brother that uses his strengths without giving him unchecked control he hasn't yet earned back. I believe in second chances, but they have to be built carefully, not handed out blindly." Ryan stood there for a long moment, the envelope in his hand unopened, his eyes moving between his father and his brother. The string lights flickered slightly overhead. Nobody in that crowded store said a word. Finally, Ryan walked over to Trent. I watched my husband, this quiet, steady man I'd loved for 9 years, pull his older brother into a hug that Trent didn't seem to know how to receive at first. His arms hanging stiffly before slowly, hesitantly, wrapping around Ryan's back. "I'm not trying to take anything from you," Ryan said. His voice rough with emotion, but clear enough for those of us standing close to hear. "I want you here. I need you here. You know things about this business I'll never know just from showing up on Saturdays. We're going to figure this out together, the right way this time." Trent's eyes were wet when he finally pulled back, and for the first time in years, I saw something on his face that looked like genuine relief rather than performance. "I don't deserve that," he said quietly. "Maybe not yet," Ryan said. "But you will." Gerald watched the two of them with an expression I'll never forget, something between exhaustion and profound peace. The look of a man finally setting down a weight he'd been carrying alone for a very long time. Later that night, after most of the guests had gone home and the staff had started quietly cleaning up paper plates and folding tables, I found Gerald standing alone near the old original register, running his fingers along its worn edges the way I'd seen him do 100 times before. "You knew it would be him," I said quietly, coming to stand beside him. "All along." Gerald smiled a tired, genuine smile. "I hoped. I never knew for certain. People surprise you in both directions, right up until the moment they don't." He looked over at where Ryan was helping Marcus stack chairs, laughing at something the older man had said, completely unaware he was being watched. Carol always said Ryan had her patience. I think she was right. It just took the rest of us a while to recognize what patience actually looks like, because it doesn't announce itself the way ambition does. I thought about the years of family dinners where Trent had dominated every conversation, the spreadsheets and projections, the loud confidence that had once seemed like the obvious marker of leadership. I thought about Ryan's quiet Saturday mornings, the questions he'd asked not because he wanted something, but because he genuinely cared, the way he'd never once tried to position himself as better than his brother, even when it would have cost him nothing to do so. "He's going to do right by Trent," I said. "I know he is." "I know it too," Gerald said. "That's exactly why I trusted him with all of it." Driving home that night, Ryan was quiet for a long stretch of the highway. The envelope sitting in the cup holder between us, still mostly unread beyond the first page he'd skimmed at the store. I reached over and rested my hand on his knee. "How are you feeling?" He let out a long breath, something between a laugh and a sigh. "Terrified, honored. Like I need about 6 months to figure out how to actually run a hardware company while still doing my engineering job." He glanced over at me, a small smile breaking through the exhaustion on his face. "But mostly I just keep thinking about something Dad said. About Trent and fire without honesty. I don't want to be someone who builds anything, a company, a family, a life, on anything other than the truth. Even when the truth is slower, even when it doesn't look as impressive at family dinners." I thought about Sarah, about envelopes and inheritances, and all the things people fight over without realizing what they actually represent. It was never really about the stores, or the keys, or the title of CEO. It was about who you become when nobody is watching, when there's no spreadsheet to impress anyone with, when the only audience is your own conscience. Gerald hadn't been testing his sons to see who deserved a prize. He'd been watching to see who had quietly become the kind of person worth trusting. With everything he'd spent his whole life building. The streetlights blurred past the window as we drove home together. The city settling into its evening rhythm around us, and I realized that whatever came next, whatever challenges waited for Ryan in those 6 stores full of nails and lumber and 41 years of his father's history, we would face them honestly. Together the way we always had. Some inheritances aren't about what gets handed to you. They're about what you've already built inside yourself, long before anyone hands you the keys at all.